This conference will now be recorded.
The November 9th, 2021 Planning Commission will please come to order. Julie, call the roll, please.
Commissioner Schauer.
Here.
Commissioner Blofis.
Here.
Commissioner Atkins. Oh, looks like he just joined.
He's joining.
All right, well, I'll come back to him. Commissioner Haroon.
Here.
Commissioner Schulte.
Here.
Vice Chair Pyle.
Here.
Chair Liddell.
Here.
And Commissioner Atkins, have you joined audio yet? Sounds like maybe not.
Yeah, let's just keep going. And I know Commissioner Atkins is trying to join, so he'll be here. We can make note in the minutes that he has joined both visually and audibly.
Okay.
Hi, this is Matt.
Consideration of the October 26th, 2021 minutes from the Planning Commission.
Chair Liddell, I just want to let you know Commissioner Atkins is with us now.
Okay. So the topic before us is the October 26 minutes. Are there any additions or corrections, comments on those minutes?
Chair, I don't have any corrections. Good minutes, read through them, look clean to me. And unless anyone else has anything, I'd like to make a motion.
Okay. There's a motion to approve the October 26 minutes by Commissioner Pyle. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Commissioner Schulte. Please call the roll, Julie.
Commissioner Schauer.
Approve.
Commissioner Blofis.
Yes.
Commissioner Atkins.
Approved.
Commissioner Haroon.
Approve.
Commissioner Schulte.
Approved.
Vice Chair Pyle.
Approve.
And Chair Liddell.
Abstain. The October 26 minutes are approved. Now we'll move to the July 6th, 2021 minutes. Are there any additions, corrections, or comments on those minutes? So 4 of us were present for that meeting, so the motion to approve will need to come from Haroon, Atkins, or Blofis.
Commissioner Haroon moves to approve the minutes.
Commissioner Haroon has moved to approve the minutes of July 6th, seconded by Commissioner Blofis. Is that correct?
Correct.
Please call the roll, Julie.
Commissioner Schauer.
Abstain.
Commissioner Blofis.
Yes.
Commissioner Atkins.
Approved.
Commissioner Haroon.
Approved.
Commissioner Schulte.
Abstain.
Vice Chair Pyle.
Abstain.
And Chair Liddell.
Approve. The July 6, 2021 minutes are approved at long last. Thank you, everybody. I have no communication from the chair. Do you have any communications, Rebecca, before we turn to the workshop item on basement storage?
I have one, and that is to remind the Planning Commission that is the time of year when we request statements of interest from folks who are willing to serve in a leadership, either chair or vice chair role in the next year in 2022. So just FYI, those will be coming out for me later this year, probably in the next few weeks. We do have appointment processes underway, and so there may be new members we need to extend that to early in the next year. And then that will occur in the first meeting of the year in January. So just wanted to provide you all with an update on that and the timeline, more to come. That's the only update I have, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Any comments before we turn it over to Brian?
Just that basement storage was before you in March of this year. The Planning Commission had feedback. We've been working with the applicant and internal staff to address some of that, as well as some other issues that were raised in our internal discussions. And we believe we have a solid proposal that responds to all of that now. So I'll turn it over to Brian Snodgrass, Principal Planner. He'll walk you through it.
Okay.
Good evening. If I could have the first slide, please. So as Rebecca mentioned, this was reviewed back in March. We're back before you because there's been not so much that the proposal has changed. We have a little bit of additional information and have fleshed out language for you that we anticipate bringing forward in the recommendation for the hearing, which is scheduled for December 14th. Next slide, please. And so just to recap on the background, the city did, on a citywide basis, revamp our storage standards back in 2019. That was based on concerns about storage uses taking up commercial properties with uses that generally are relatively low employment and activity levels. As part of that process citywide, new storage was prohibited within 500 feet of major corridors. There were some other standards about the nature of the storage buildings. And an existing prohibition on that was already in place on prohibiting storage in the downtown CX zone, shown here in red, was continued. Next slide. And in late 2020, we had a proposal by Randy Prince of Cascadia Partners, who's here with us tonight on the call. And it was to amend the zoning code standards to allow within the CX zone self-storage businesses, but restricted to basements. And his firm's interest was just in the Quinn building at 911 Main. Obviously, we would have to look at potential standards that would apply throughout the downtown. As a practical matter, we estimated that there might be 10 to 20 buildings that at least might have a basement that could qualify, not necessarily that had market interest. And this proposal is, the applicant has indicated, is geared towards downtown businesses and residents. Next slide, please. And so as part of the initial outreach, we talked to the Vancouver Downtown Association. I presented at one of their board meetings. We talked to some of the known property owners of buildings, older buildings that might be eligible, and had some ongoing internal discussion and did research of other jurisdictions. Next slide, please. And so from that, some of the concerns or issues raised were, there were some concerns from some of the VDA members that they wanted to attract more active uses in those basement areas. They mentioned restaurants and bars. We haven't had any of those yet, but that was the interest. There was also internal discussions, particularly with police, fire and building. After some initial discussions more recently, I think fire and building staff both indicated they were fully satisfied with the existing regulatory authorities that they have within their codes to ensure safety. And one of the issues raised by the Planning Commission, and I believe it was Commissioner Atkins at the March meeting, was just wanting to make sure that existing basement parking where it existed didn't get displaced by storage. And also that buildings that may potentially, if there are any that are on sloped ground, that they only be eligible if the storage, if the basement storage is below ground at all portions of all sides of the building. Next slide. So the anticipated staff recommendation that pending today's discussion, we envision bringing back before you for the December hearing is to add the language in yellow. We would first amend the use table in the CX zone to indicate that the CX area is eligible for storage, amend the footnote that applies to all of the areas where it's eligible, and saying that within the CX zoning district, self-storage be limited to areas of 10,000 square feet or less, located entirely below ground and not used for parking at the time of the ordinance, provided all applicable fire, building, and change of use standards are fully met. And the 10,000 square foot limit was, we as staff recommended that. It's based on the idea of wanting to more or less limit these uses to approximately 1/4 of a footprint of a typical downtown building. And the 10,000 square foot level, or threshold rather, also has some precedent in different non-basement contexts, but in our neighborhood commercial zones, for instance. So wanting to capitalize on that, just to keep impacts, particularly parking and loading at a low level, we had contemplated requiring a parking or loading plan, and it seemed more, it seemed simpler and easier to administer to simply set a cap, which in this case, this proposal for the Quinn building would be able to meet. And we would also need to tweak some of the language within the self-storage standards just to indicate that at least in the downtown, the 500-foot distance to major roadways does not apply. Next slide. And so again, next steps, we wanted to circle back to the Downtown Association. The only time we could do that was November 18th coming up. I'll be presenting again. You have your public hearing scheduled for this on December 14th. We've not yet scheduled council time. And next slide, and that concludes the presentation. Happy to answer, well, excuse me, just to set some of the sort of legal framework, just because this is somewhat unusual of receiving a privately submitted zoning code text change. So under our code, we do have that provision though, that we can, such changes can be processed. City staff evaluates rather than sponsors. And we work with the applicant, which we did I think quite well in this case, to shape the proposed text language with some limitations. And the criteria that you'll be considering the proposal on in December and we'll be providing suggested findings within the staff report is simply consistency with the comprehensive plan and strategic plan and the overall public interest. Next slide. So that concludes the presentation. Happy to answer any questions. Again, we also have the applicant is on the call as well.
So is the applicant there? Can you hear me? Yeah. Do you have any comments you'd like to make at this time?
I guess the only comments that I would make, Brian, I think summarized things pretty well, and you guys probably remember the last workshop that we had. The highlights of that were simply that, one, storage is already an allowed use in all of the buildings that we're talking about that have, that have basements in downtown. And we've actually developed our own, some of those buildings, and with not many, any true restrictions on them. What we're trying to accomplish here is simply to allow those basement storage areas, as limited as Brian discussed, both by the existing self-storage code and the limitations here, to allow folks who may not have access, particularly downtown office tenants, some downtown commercial or retail tenants, and theoretically some potential downtown residential tenants, although most of the at least newer residential buildings like the Uptown that we did, or Aria, and some of the stuff that Holland is doing have, I think, some basement storage in them. But some of the older residential units downtown, particularly those that are over retail, don't have any access to that storage. And so the idea here is, this doesn't change the sort of the demand for storage. It simply changes, hopefully in a positive way, the way that those storage needs get satisfied. And right now, most of those needs get satisfied by loading up boxes, getting in your car and driving out to one of the suburban large mini storage places like Iron Gate and Fortress and some of those. And I know that when I was at Landerholm for 25 years, and we had hundreds and hundreds of boxes of of documents from having a law firm that's been there for over 50 years, and some of that obviously is getting changed today to electronic, being electronically stored, but there's still a huge need and use of of storage for physical paper documents, particularly, and other things, whether it's it would be some equipment for a restaurant or whatever. To not have to get in your car, your truck, and drive somewhere to access that. Most of these spaces are are underutilized or are already used for storage. And in sort of the jobs or employment context, I think that one other thing to sort of note is that if would you prefer to take what I think most people would recognize as being pretty difficult space to get a very high jobs per acre count on in an existing basement in one of our downtown buildings versus building a new multifamily storage, or not multifamily, self-storage space out in an industrial area or commercial area that might otherwise get a much higher jobs per acre utilization. So, again, you're going to have the demand for storage, and the space of the storage space that's out there is going to go someplace. And so the question is where do you want it and how do you want to access it? So I think those are kind of the only things. The other, I guess, the last item is we did spend some time with Dean Bray on the fire marshal's side, and certainly with Brian and Shri, who's the head of the building department, talking about what additional limitations, if any, should we have. We went through and looked at sort of all the common ones and proposed those, which is everything from no residential uses and no hazardous materials, obviously, no creatures or living creatures or organisms, no unlawful purpose, no firearms, the laundry list that you see in almost all sort of commercial and residential agreements. Anyway, and I think staff, fire marshal, and building determined, and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, that there are enough limitations currently in the city's existing self-storage code that they felt those were adequate to deal with any issues that might arise here.
That's correct.
Okay, that's all I've got. I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Okay, thank you, Mr. So I'll go around and check and see if you have questions for either Brian or Mr. Prince. Commissioner Haroon?
Yeah, Brian, thanks for the presentation. My one thing that I'm getting a little tripped up on is the fully below ground. I know I remember the discussion back as far as like defining what a basement is, but my experience, at least residentially, is if you have an 8-foot basement, 6 feet is below ground, and then you have 2 foot of exposed foundation, and then you'd have like a top floor joist system on top of that. And so you'd be, call it 70% below ground or whatever, 2/3 below ground. I think we all kind of understand what a basement is versus not a basement, but it would be, as one who's gotten tripped up in, the minutia of the code before, I wouldn't want somebody that's like, has a basement, but a foot of it's protruding above the sidewalk before their floor system, and everybody would acknowledge it as a basement, but it's not quote unquote fully below ground. Was that looked at all, or what was that's just my thoughts when I'm reading that portion?
No, I think you're raising a good point, and I'd want to circle back with staff, particularly building staff, and see if we can't have a more precise definition. I think the original comment, which came out of the March PC discussion, was, and I'll invite Commissioner Atkins to jump in too here, because I think he raised it, was, at least as I understood it, was that if any of the 4 sides of a building are exposed, either the basement is either exposed for the entirety of the floor or most of it, so that it's a viable first floor spot, that those shouldn't be eligible in this case. So I think you're raising a good point. I think we need a little bit tighter language that doesn't capture those ones where it's a couple of feet.
Yeah, and I too remember the conversation, and I think it's a great point. It's just when you get into the technicalities, most basements, in my experience, aren't fully below ground, but we would all consider them a basement. So that's the, and then even if there's something in there that gives the planning official some leeway, to make a reasonable judgment. I don't know how that works, but yeah, that's my one thought with that.
Commissioner Atkins, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think it just needs some definition. I've done a lot of daylight basement projects, and it's possible to have one side exposed. So I think it's great that staff is looking for a solution for this instead of just saying no. And I think just trying to define what is a basement and coming up with some reasonable definition so that in the future that it's clear. So that was the point I was trying to make way back when, just because I've done a lot of daylight basement projects, and one side can be viable and one side can't.
Commissioner Blofeld?
Thanks, Chair. When you guys contacted other jurisdictions, did we see that anything we're proposing here is different than what's existing out there? And was there any suggestions or anything that you learned from that outreach?
Yeah, there was, and I probably should have spoken about that a little bit, although I think we talked about it perhaps in March as well. But the only jurisdiction we could find that was relatively analogous, where they allowed storage in basements, but in a sort of a downtown setting, but not above, was Salt Lake City.
Okay. And this is pretty consistent with what they have currently?
Yeah, I think we're going into a little bit more, we're saying a little bit more than what they appear to have. My understanding, just reading reading the staff report, and the memo you have links to their staff report, Salt Lake staff report. So I'll look at that, but was that it was somewhat similar in that a test case came forward. Somebody there wanted to do it and thought it and made a good case, and the city of Salt Lake went along with it.
Okay, thank you. And then, so you met with the board of the Vancouver Downtown Association, and I saw there's going to be a follow-up meeting. Is that going to be with the full membership, or is it going to be with the board again?
I think it's board. I'm not 100% certain about that. It's on the 18th.
Okay. Seems like there may be some different views from people other than the board, but and then I really
maybe offer some clarification there, Commissioner Blofeld. They're full, so their board will distribute it out to their committee structure and can distribute information to their full membership, but they don't have a regular full membership meeting that we could go to. The board and their committees are really, my understanding, what we have to work through. So we can encourage them to distribute it though, if that would be helpful.
we don't know if they have.
Yeah, I don't believe they have a standing full membership meeting. I think they have quarterly meetings that's optional, and they could decide to include it in their agenda. So we can encourage that, but the board is and the executive directors,
Okay.
I think, how we can reach those people. So we'll try that.
Okay, yeah, just, it seems like there would be some varying views there maybe. And then I really appreciate the outreach on fire and building staff, because my issue was safety, and that seems to be covered well. Then my last question, the 10 to 20 building sites is consistent, and that number stayed the same. So I'm guessing the 10,000 square feet applies to everybody you originally thought would be a possible candidate for this business.
Yeah, the 10,000 square foot limit, as well as all of the provisions we're talking about here, would apply throughout the CX zone. So if it turns out there's fewer old buildings that are structurally able to do this, then there would be fewer potential applicants. If there's more, there might potentially be more. It will be interesting to see how much of a market there is for it. We don't know that at this point.
Okay, no, I appreciate the outreach. Good job at that. Thank you.
Commissioner Shower?
Thank you. I certainly appreciate, and may be evidenced by my background today, that storage space needs to be flexible in the future. Brian, if you could come back to the early slide with the highlighted text, might be helpful to my comments. So I've looked at all kinds of sort of future casting of land use, and the big thing folks are saying is that parking, traditional stacked storage parking, will be the large scale infrastructure that gets redeployed in the future. So parking garages, other things, if autonomous vehicles take root, parking garages become an archaic piece of infrastructure. I guess I would suggest I might encourage staff to think about future-proofing this highlighted text. I don't see the advantage in the text that says, and not used for parking at the time of this ordinance. I would suggest that maybe when a request is put into place, that they comply with whatever the parking code is at the time. 25 years, we're going to have very different parking expectations or limitations. And to me, having the code future-proof itself a little bit, as we change our parking needs, I think that garages and underground stuff is going to get completely rethought as it's sort of wasted space. But that's a nitpicky point that probably we could just ignore and adopt this and be fine. I just think parking is a very, very dynamic environment at the moment. Otherwise, I think this is a brilliant approach to a common problem. We might help ourselves from consuming more real estate with mini storage buildings in a suburban area. It's a real need. I think people keep wanting to buy stuff, and that's what the economy is based on. So let's let them store it wherever they can. So I think this is a great public-private partnership to a problem maybe none of us knew existed. So I really appreciate the city's perspective in responding to the applicant's request. That's all I've got. Thank you, Chair.
Commissioner Pyle.
Thanks, Chair. I'm very supportive of this change, barring the clarification on what's a basement, what's not a daylight basement. To Commissioner Shower's point, it's a good point. I imagine the entire parking code gets reworked at some point, and we could tackle all of that then. But I just generally think of this in terms of what's the highest and best use for a basement. And I can only think of one or two businesses in downtown Vancouver. I think Kindred Home Supply tried to be in a basement near or below Brood for a bit, and that wasn't working. So they moved upstairs because it's just hard to run a business out of a basement. And if storage is one of those businesses that can be successfully run out of a basement, then sounds good to me. Thanks.
Commissioner Schulte.
Yes, I've just got one comment, and it's on this page 7 that we're looking at right now, third line down in the yellow. I'm wondering, after the word ordinance at the end of that line, if we should have the word adoption. To me, the phrase "at the time of this ordinance" is a little awkward, and I think it makes more sense to say something at the time of this ordinance adoption. Brian, do you have a thought on that front?
I think that's a good catch. That's a good catch. I think it's implied, but it's better stated than implied. So we'll rework the language to reference adoption.
Okay, thank you. And that's all I had.
Okay. I think from what you've heard tonight, the defining the basement clearly is really important moving forward. I'm supportive of the direction this is going. I too think the definitions of parking is going to change, but we can't do that at this time with this ordinance. So anybody else have any other comments, questions?
Chair, Commissioner Haroon.
Commissioner Haroon?
Yeah, so just kind of a clarification on the 10,000 square feet or less. I'm just thinking of I just did a tour of a bunch of apartments over in Portland that are 350 square foot apartments that I'm sure those people need additional storage. If a developer was to develop, say, a city block and wanted to expend the expense of creating a large basement on the entire city block and wanted to use that storage, are we trying to limit? Is it the limiting of the storage space, or because as we densify, there's kind of this nexus of like, if you could create additional basement storage or like truly below ground storage, that wouldn't make sense to ever put housing units in, but it would make sense from a financial standpoint to dig out the basement and put storage units in. Is it the intent to limit those kind of opportunities, or what's the reason for the 10,000 square foot restriction?
Well, it would not apply to if a residential developer wanted to provide storage for the building, as I've seen in many cases too. And it could be of any form of storage. I think even if they wanted to charge their tenants for it, or bike storage or what have you, that wouldn't apply because it would be part of the residential use. What this would apply to is self-storage businesses that cater to the outside world beyond that building. And the intent here was an effort to recognize that downtown's a busy place. It's going to become busier, and things like parking and loading are potentially issues, if not necessarily right just yet, in many cases. And so having a limit that kept the private outward-facing operation modestly sized seemed like an appropriate way of addressing those impacts.
Okay, no, that makes sense. I mean, I guess I was thinking of it more from a hybrid model, that if a developer wanted to, have storage rental units for his tenants, and then, maybe the balance he's renting out to the general public, or she, that if that was something that we wanted to, I guess, keep a rein on, so to speak. And if that's the intent, then that makes sense. So I guess that was my clarification. So is my understanding correct then, that we're trying to keep that reined in with the size?
I think so, to a point, yes, especially, this is our first go at downtown storage. So it's conceivable in 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, we get somebody who wants to do quite a bit more, and who knows, maybe a case can be made, and at that point we could adjust the code. But I think this is an effort to be just a little bit cautious, I think, at the start, and recognizing that we do, if basements can be used for other active uses, that's great too. And so addressing those kind of impacts and the impacts of parking and loading is why we picked a number here to keep things relatively modestly sized.
Cool. Makes sense. Thank you.
Brian, one other point that may be helpful for Planning Commission is, at least in today's world, at today's costs, and some of you who have built buildings in terms of doing, say, underground parking, and the city has looked at this obviously for a long time, and folks who've done downtown buildings like us have too. It is extremely expensive, and while it would be less expensive, say, to do a basement that was for storage rather than parking, my guess is that it wouldn't come close to being to sort of penciling or making financial sense to build a basement, under new construction that was solely going to be used for self-service storage. The most likely uses for this are going to be in existing buildings, of which there's obviously a limited amount of multi-story buildings that have basements. So maybe the dynamics or the financial side changes in the future, but right now I think I would be very, very surprised if somebody would take a vacant lot downtown and pay to build a basement in it that they were then going to solely rent out for self-storage for third parties. So.
Thank you, Mr. Prince. Commissioner Blofeld.
Yeah, the 10,000 square foot, when I saw that, I got to thinking, are we better off having one big one rather than one spread out, throughout this downtown area? And I don't know where the break even is for them to make money. There has to be some kind of threshold, I would think, where you'd have to have so many square feet in order to make it a viable business. I don't know if we've looked into that at all. I think also that one good reason for having the smaller square feet is you'd have less traffic into that area as opposed to if you had a giant one. So that would probably be a plus. And I think we talked earlier about one of the things about this type of operation. If a restaurant or bar wanted to come in and they think they can make a go of it, it would be a better use of that property. They probably make more. I know some of the best cities I've been to across the United States have basement bars, restaurants, and some of them are the best in the country. So it's a viable use, and if it works for that, I think people would look at that naturally. But yeah, the 10,000, I kind of went back and forth on in my own mind, but I think at the end I kind of concur with staff. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Brian, do you want to say any more about why you ended up with 10,000 feet in the staff report?
No, I think we want to just, as mentioned, it's about a quarter size of most of the downtown footprints. And it's also a threshold that we, elsewhere in our code, we use 10,000 square feet. So it seemed to make some sense. It's consistent with this proposal. So I think all of those reasons.
Anybody else? Okay, thank you, Brian. So we will be in recess until 6:30.
That's correct. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Julie, this is Laura. I'd like to do a mic check.
Julie,
Yes.
Mr. Prince spoke as the applicant during our workshop. Do we know if he still wants to speak during the community forum?
I kind of assume no. We'll see if he rejoins, but I would be surprised if he had any more to say.
Me too. And we don't have anybody signed up to speak during the hearing in the way of
That's correct.
citizen testimony.
That's correct. He was the only one that registered.
Julie, this is Monica Tuberville. May I do a sound check?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thank you.
Julie, this is Laura Hoggett asking for a sound check.
I can hear you as well.
Thank you.
Hey, Julie, I just wanted to check and see if you could hear me.
I can hear you.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I'm just gonna give CVTV a call, but we should be ready to go in just a minute.
Chair, I'm seeing everybody, at least their initials, except Vice Chair Pyle. Is that correct? Everybody seeing the same thing I am?
Yes.
Okay. She'll be joining us very quickly.
We're ready to go whenever you are.
Okay. Did we show everyone back, Rebecca? This is a continuation of the November 9th, 2021 Planning Commission. Earlier this evening, we had a workshop on basement storage. So this is the community forum part of our meeting. Julie, has anybody registered for the community forum?
We only had one registrant, that was Randy Prince, and he spoke earlier. I don't see him on the line anymore, so I assume that he said what he planned to say.
Okay, so the community forum is closed and we will move to the public hearing. The role of the Planning Commission is to review and analyze proposed ordinances, comprehensive plan amendments, zoning changes, and other land use related issues. We follow a public process, including holding hearings, during which the public has an opportunity to provide additional perspectives. In legislative matters, the role of the Commission is advisory. The City Council will hold separate hearings, consider our recommendations, and make a final determination. The Planning Commission will conduct a public hearing tonight and take testimony on the matter being regarded. Community members who registered by 12 p.m. today will be called upon to address the Planning Commission during the public testimony portion. At the conclusion of the public testimony, the Commission will deliberate and make a recommendation to Council. Would anyone on the Planning Commission like to disclose any conflicts of interest? Before we begin the hearing, please ensure your microphones are turned off or muted during the presentation. Ms. Kennedy, do you have comments before we move to the hearing on the Parks, Recreation, and Culture Services Comprehensive Plan update?
I do, just briefly, Chair. Thank you. Similar to my comments when I introduced the workshop on this item 2 weeks ago, just want to frame sort of the scope of the review for the Planning Commission tonight. So this is the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Services Comprehensive Plan, and you're essentially reviewing it because and making a recommendation about whether or not to adopt it as into the comprehensive plan by reference. So this is not, and I just want to be clear, is not the parks element of the comprehensive plan. We will be tackling that and aligning it with this as part of the overall comp plan update. What you're looking at tonight is whether or not you want to recommend to the council to adopt this by reference into the comp plan. So just a narrower scope of decision given where we are at. A larger scope of decision is forthcoming as part of the comprehensive plan update. With that, I'll turn it over to Dave Perlich, Interim Director, Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Services, and Monica Tuberville, Senior Planner in that same department. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. And given those introductory comments, I want to immediately go to Monica, and we'll look at review and resummarization of our Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Services Comprehensive Focus Plan. And I'm available here for questions as we get through this later in the evening. Thanks.
I see Monica here. Monica, let us know if you're having any trouble.
There we are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
All right. Well, I've been having computer difficulties all day, so that was kind of a scary moment. So good afternoon. It's nice to see you all again. It's only been a couple of weeks. I have a brief presentation for you this afternoon regarding the updates to the Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Services Plan. And we reviewed this with you on October 26th in a workshop. You could move to the next slide, please, Julie. So I'll provide you with just a quick review of the materials that we covered in the workshop, including the purpose and process for the park plan update, public outreach, and the major park components and amendments, and the compliance with the RCO requirements, the Vancouver Comp Plan, Strategic Plan, and Growth Management Act as required by City Code and state regulations for plan amendments. We spent, I think it was 6 workshops with our Parks Recreation Advisory Commission and several with council working through key components for the plan update, and also developing a variety of tools to serve future needs of residents for access to the park system. On the 20th of October, the Parks Advisory Commission made a final recommendation for council to support adoption of the plan as it's proposed. Next slide, please. There are multiple reasons for the park plan update, which we have discussed. Our last plan was updated in 2014, and the park plan must be updated for the city to remain eligible for state RCO grant funding. The park plan is also part of a phased coordination with the Vancouver Comp Plan update, as Rebecca mentioned. Updates to the plan always provide us opportunities to renew our vision, be good stewards of our park system and our funding sources, and also be intentional to reflect the interests of our community. Our proposal is to amend Appendix E of the comp plan, the city comp plan, with adoption of the updated park plan by reference. Next slide, please. This table provides you with a summary of the overall park plan update process that was launched in April of this year. It's certainly been an expedited process, to say the least, but by completing the plan by the end of the year, it does allow staff to focus our efforts on grant projects that must begin preparation early next year. Next slide, please. The major components of the plan update are listed here, and I'll touch on each of them briefly. I also just want to remind you of some of the themes that are threaded throughout the plan that we mentioned before. The plan emphasizes the vital role that parks, recreation, and cultural services play in determining the quality of life in the city, and also the economic vitality to maximize the recreational potential of our existing system through reinvestment, and also to be strategic in our investments in order to meet the growing demand as well as the growing diversity of our community. And we were purposeful to address council priorities and objectives for climate action, diversity, equity, inclusion, and public safety in the analysis as well as the proposed projects. Next slide, please. Our public outreach used a variety of techniques to glean input from our community. The most important takeaways are that people truly value their park system and the opportunities to get outdoors and exercise and socialize. They also want a quality interconnected system within safe walking distance from their homes. This has been a consistent message throughout all of our park plans, to be honest, throughout the years, but even more so as the community has weathered the pandemic. The desire for safe and walkable neighborhoods was also echoed through the public response that received through the Vancouver Move survey for the transportation plan as a high priority. Some of the suggestions that were received from the underrepresented organizations that were involved in the outreach process that are included in the park plan include incorporating universal accessibility park assets into the design and update of our community parks, and we'll continue to partner with Harper's Playground and others in order to achieve these goals. We'll be partnering with other departments to explore options for off-site sidewalk improvements for safer and interconnected neighborhoods, and include multi-language materials in our marketing and our outreach, and encourage more multicultural special events in our park system. Next slide, please. New sections for cultural services, recreation, special events, volunteers, and urban youth are included in the plan to tell the full story of how the department serves the city. And with cultural services now part of Parks and Rec, we're excited about the opportunities for a unified approach to incorporating the arts, culture, and heritage into the park system to enrich the city. These new sections provide program descriptions, lists of assets, participation metrics, and goals to help us plan to serve the city residents in the future. Next slide, please. Park acquisition and distribution standards guide the number of parks and their location, and there are no changes to those standards proposed in this plan update. But the update does include some additional analysis tools to identify service gaps and underrepresented residents to better inform our park needs and prioritize our funding. We used in-depth GIS analysis by census block to identify high-density land use areas that have a greater need for outdoor spaces, and also concentrations of underserved and more vulnerable residents based on socioeconomic criteria. We completed an assessment by park service area as well that takes into account park quality variables that will influence the recreational experience for the user in both the built and the natural landscape, and also park safety variables in an acknowledgement of the age and declining quality of honestly a large percentage of the park system. So we'll continue to update these tools. It's a matrix as well as a whole series of maps, which I shared with you. When we'll update that when the 2020 census data is available for ongoing planning purposes. And it also will serve as a means to monitor our progress using these metrics. Next slide, please. The park inventory was updated to include new acquisition development projects since the 2014 update. Parks and natural areas owned by other providers were included and accounted for almost 1,000 acres. We also completed an in-depth analysis in cooperation with the school districts that resulted in adding elementary school field acreage to the neighborhood park inventory at a reduced rate to reflect the public use of these spaces for recreation, but also to acknowledge their limited availability during daylight hours outside of school use. I did mention that middle school and high school grounds were determined by the school districts to be generally unavailable due to more regular programming of their fields. Next slide, please. The plan proposes the addition of 2 park classifications, one being for civic plazas and linear parks. These classifications are intended to serve land use patterns with high density residential development and also those generating high day use demand from employees and visitors to surrounding uses. These types of facilities are envisioned to provide a community benefit that does contribute to the whole park system and also stimulate economic vitality. And as recommended by your comments, the plan does note the need to involve park staff in review of mixed land use projects early in the process and also to explore public-private agreements to support the ongoing and high-level maintenance requirements of these types of park improvements. And it also acknowledges both the public and private benefits provided by these assets. Next slide, please. We have proposed some innovative approaches to the typical improvements included in our parks to help meet the growing demand for access to the outdoors. These include the themed play structures throughout the park system to create unique neighborhood identity and also some recreational variety. As I mentioned, the popularity of the dinosaur play area at Nikkei Park gives us a great testimony of the public's desire for these unique play spaces. We are hearing that people from out of state and even a few comments from out of country about this park. So that's pretty phenomenal. We're also proposing support services such as restrooms, picnic shelters, and parking areas will be strategically located throughout the system in our neighborhood parks where access to community parks is limited. We will be including universally accessible play structures and other assets in all of our new community parks and also in the community park replacement of play structures. We propose proactive implementation of the 2019 state legislation to protect pollinator species through park design and maintenance practices by using compatible plant species in landscaped areas and also in natural space enhancements where possible with a target of 25%. And then we evaluated our inventory of urban natural areas to identify those that could be improved with access and safety enhancements at a relatively minimal cost that would provide some increased opportunity for passive recreation use. Altogether, collectively, these proposals will help us to serve the community better and to make the best use of our existing system. Next slide, please. The vision, mission, and community goals included in the plan were updated and to be more concise and accurately reflect council objectives of diversity, equity, and inclusion, climate readiness, and public safety. Include input from our community outreach and also the results identified in our park need and level of service analysis tools. Next slide, please. The plan includes a list of proposed capital projects for a 10-year period. The project priorities are based on our park standards, the park need analysis, and also the park equity and level of service tools that we discussed, including repairs and replacements needed for reinvestment for an equitable and sustainable system. Cost estimates, potential funding sources are also identified. Projects must be included in the CFP to be eligible for use of park impact fee funding, as well as they must also be listed for grant project applications. The CFP needs to provide enough flexibility to facilitate unexpected needs and take advantage of partnership opportunities. And we recognize that there is a significant funding shortfall if we were to implement all of the projects identified, and that additional funding will be needed to supplement particularly PIF and general fund for capital repairs and for improved equitable access if we were to accomplish it in a reasonable time period. And as I said before, bottom line, projects can only move forward when we do have committed funding and approval through the budget process. Next slide, please. The proposed amendments to the park plan as described are found to be consistent with the planning requirements of the Washington State Recreation and Conservation Office for our grant eligibility. Next slide, please. The amendments are also consistent with the applicable sections of the city's strategic plan, the Vancouver Comp Plan, and further the public interest based on present conditions and future projected needs. Next slide, please. And finally, the plan is in compliance with the GMA park and rec elements that require a capital facilities plan, park need and demand, estimates for a 10-year period, and also regional approaches to meet that demand. Next slide. The staff recommendation to the Planning Commission is to forward a recommendation for adoption of the Vancouver Parks, Recreation and Cultural Services Comp Plan by reference into the Appendix E of the Vancouver Comp Plan. Next slide, please. This last slide just provides you with a quick outline of our next steps. The SEPA comment period and appeal periods have expired, and we haven't received any comments to date. Our final work session with council is scheduled for the 22nd of November to cover the last two components for their consideration. That would be the capital facilities plan and the goals and objectives. And then the council's first reading would be on December 13th, and then final action on December 20th for review of the comp plan. Next slide, please. So before I turn it back to you for your deliberations, I did have one final comment regarding a question that was asked in our work session regarding tree canopy provided by the park system, and I just wanted to follow up with you on that. I did speak with Charles in urban forestry Charles Ray in urban forestry, and he shared that their consultant will be providing a presentation on the results of the study that I referenced on the urban tree canopy to the Urban Forestry Commission on November 17th at 6 o'clock. So I would recommend that we all tune into that and listen to their expertise on that, because it'll be very interesting. But in general, the open space district, which includes the park system predominantly, is about 10% of the city's acreage. But it provides about 17% of the tree canopy, and obviously a significant opportunity for additional plantings. So with that, that concludes my comments, and Dave and I are both available for your questions, and Laura Hogat is also online for any questions.
One initial question I have, you did a good job on the accessibility and reaching out to a variety of people. And the rendering we have in front of us right now shows a park bench with the back on it. And I just wondered, as you look at universal design, are part of the park standards that, because it's for people 8 to 80, so to speak, with all abilities, that the park benches do have backs, or does it just depend?
I believe, I honestly don't know the right answer to that one. I'd have to check with Terry Snyder, but that's what I see the most, and so I would presume that that is correct.
I would just note it makes a big difference for older people whether those park benches have a back, and for younger people who have little kids that they're trying to corral. So,
yeah, so they don't fall off.
Exactly.
Yeah,
so I'll go around
older
and
people too.
I'll go around and ask my colleagues if they have questions, starting with Commissioner Schulte.
Yes, let me start by saying I'm very impressed with the effort you're putting forward and the way this is looking. It's really going to be a good thing for our community. I do have a question with respect to annexations. I believe I read that all the work is being done with the current city boundary in place. So how would annexations be addressed in the future?
The way the park impact fee program was structured is we purposely have our park districts include the entire urban growth area. So upon annexation, it would be by default that those would automatically be part of that system that then would be contributing to this. And we would proceed with any necessary updates to the park plan through the annual review process for updates to our needs analysis and that sort of thing. So that's how I would envision adjusting to any future annexations.
Okay, thank you very much.
Commissioner Pyle.
I don't have any questions for Monica at this time. Thanks.
Commissioner Shower.
I guess I would just like to compliment the work. I think, soapbox for just a moment, parks is an undervalued component of the things that we do. I mean undervalued, it seems discretional at times for budget. I think a good strategic plan like this is going to position us to better fund this system in the future. And I would articulate a view that I don't think parks are just for residents. I think it's an incredibly important part of the business community's ability to attract and retain talent. So I think a plan like this that keeps pushing the limit and pushes the bar to invest in these and frankly repair the facilities that we haven't had resources to repair is just such important work. So I applaud the effort, and I'm supportive would be an understatement. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Bluffett.
Thank you, Chair. I do have a couple of questions, but before, I also agree it's overall a very good plan. A lot of work has gone into it. It's really evident. I read the whole thing again today and very impressed with it. And also want to thank Monica for getting back to me on the tree canopy. It was, the number's a little smaller than I thought on the first one, but the relationship shows how valuable the parks are to the overall canopy. So I'll be tuning in on the 17th. Hopefully I'll be available to do that. The questions I have, I guess first on the analysis tools, are those new tools that you're proposing, or have those been used in the past?
We have always used that criteria in as best we could without actual quantified tools. We had never done a full inventory with a very specific criteria, nor did we ever have the mapping tools to help us visually see where those high need areas, a lot of it we knew intuitively where the high need areas were, but these tools allow us to have actual quantifiable numbers and visual tools that will guide not only the planning process, but if we are doing a development project, we have all of those tools that can zoom into specifics that are more applicable to that that process as well.
And the majority of the data is coming from census data, is that correct?
Yes, I mean, it all came from the census data, but I mean, a lot of different sources take it, project it in a variety of ways, but that is the primary source in the Americans community survey as well.
It'd be very interesting to see what it does to those models. I'm assuming the other data sources are more of a calibration to make sure it kind of makes sense, probably, that you have in other areas. And a question on the, I thought the outreach was excellent. There was a survey, there was in-person stakeholder. We didn't see any demographic data, the 23, or was it 2,300 or 23,000 people, I can't remember which it is, that you talked to, kind of what they look like. Were they a cross section of Vancouver? Do they tend to be one demographic over another? There was no data in there to talk about that. You gave results, but nothing in aggregate of how those played out. And I guess, go ahead.
No, excuse me, go ahead.
No, I'll ask that and then I'll have a follow-up.
I was just going to ask Laura Hogat to chime in. She did more of the analysis of the actual data set. So she might have more information on the actual demographics of the respondents to the surveys.
Hi, this is Laura. So I was really happy to participate and do the outreach for this. We were really excited to have so many respondents to our first survey. I'd like to say that it matched exactly the demographics of the city of Vancouver, but it didn't. But we tracked it pretty closely, and we watched it throughout the process to make sure that we had a good, diverse cross-section of the community. And so when we were seeing that we needed more diverse community members, we were able to meet with people in the parks where they live. And so we were able to get the feedback through that, as well as when we met with stakeholders on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we were able to get more feedback directly to those questions through those stakeholder meetings. So we realized that the survey responses themselves didn't match exactly our demographics for the city, but we felt like we tried to make some extra efforts to reach out to more people. I hope that helps.
That does help, and I appreciate the response. I know that these are kind of typical ways of getting feedback from folks, and it's kind of part of the equity problem is we're not able to get to the people that don't normally participate in these processes. And it sounds like you're making first steps to make that happen. I know cities like Tacoma are doing a lot in this area, and they're actually going where the people are. So just like you did with the parks, but I think that's more that the city needs to do more of that, making sure we're getting out and talking to everyone and not just getting the same responses from the same people like we have historically. So I appreciate that response. Thank you. And then the last question on the PIF, we made changes in 2020 and we're on like a 6-year plan right now. And you said that doesn't match up with the capital facilities plan and the projects that are proposed. Is there a huge gap there, or are you finding that this new PIF process is actually a much better situation for funding than we used to have prior to 2020, or too early to tell, or what are you seeing so far?
Well, we definitely know that the fees that were adopted are short of actual costs, and even since 2020, the land costs and material costs and labor costs have gone up significantly. And the 6-year plan, as you referenced, it's rolling up to the estimated costs for 2020. So we are a bit behind. It doesn't mean that we couldn't consider additional amendments to that before the 6-year process is completed, although I don't know if any of us want to weather that again. But we took an estimate based on the PIF funding in the accounts and the projected PIF revenue, as well as, a ballpark estimate of our grants. And I hesitate to even give you a number, but it's better than I thought. But may I just say it's over 50%. But we want to do a more detailed analysis before we get to the final council review, but we just haven't had a chance to complete that yet.
Excellent. Thank you for your responses. And I, again, appreciate the work. It's well done. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you.
Commissioner Atkins?
Thank you, Chair. Actually, the questions I had were covered by others, so thank you very much. It was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Haroon?
Yeah, thanks much for the presentation. I have a couple questions on equity. A few years ago, you testified, and I want to say it was David Douglas Park, there was a conscious decision not to invest in that park specifically or those areas because of the fear of if we improve the facility, that it would increase gentrification and start pricing people out of that area. And so then it kind of created a quandary of we're investing in the wealthier neighborhoods, but not the poor neighborhoods because we don't want to affect housing prices. In our equity lens now with this plan, is that still a policy that we're pursuing, or has that taken a different tact or change?
It is a quandary. I would agree with that. But I would also say, my perspective is that if we provide quality parks throughout the city, there will be less of that. It's just how, can we do it at a fast enough pace to spread out these improvements that gentrification doesn't happen. It will certainly be something that we have to be mindful of and work with CED to explore that and minimize it if we start to see concerns. But I don't know that I have the answer to that other than to say that we are definitely trying to look at providing equitable access. So we are specifically looking at areas or what we call equity focus areas in that mapping series I showed you, that those are the areas we do not anticipate having park impact fees for because they are not growing, but we are still looking for funding to make sure that we can support safe and quality parks to serve those areas. But if those are available everywhere, then I don't think gentrification will be as big of an issue.
Chair, it's Rebecca, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate Monica's response and just want to address this at a broader level. So a couple of thoughts here. One, we know that not all investments are the same in terms of how they might impact market speculation related to housing. And we understand that, improvements in public infrastructure, public space can trigger housing increases. There are things that you can do to offset it. I also want to just quickly ground us in differentiating between involuntary displacement and gentrification. Gentrification is improvements to a neighborhood. It's when you improve things and it results in the involuntary displacement of low-income people, communities of color, and other vulnerable communities that we have an issue. And we hear this when we go out and talk to people. People tell us, do not invest in this area because you fear gentrification and displacement. We need stuff. We need stuff here. And so really it is about what is our comprehensive approach to prioritizing and layering investments so that when you invest in things that we know will over time increase the cost of housing, the value of property in an area, we do other things to ensure that it maintains a place that's accessible and inclusive of lots of other people, like invest in affordable housing, affordable home ownership programs, and stuff like that. So that's a long-term game, and it is a complex problem that no city in the world, or the United States at least that I know of, has figured out. But we are working to think about these things comprehensively. And so as we look at the comprehensive plan update, as the council considers to or continues to consider our vulnerability index and the various analyses that we are using that as a foundation for, I think we will get clearer about our policy objectives related to just your question, Commissioner Roon. But I think we really need to, so I guess to respond, I think know that this discussion is going on. And I think something you're probably getting at, which we've heard, is don't not invest in an area because you fear displacement and think there's nothing you can do about it, because those communities need resources too. You just have to be very thoughtful about how you do it and balance it with potential mitigating investments as well. And so the city's going down that path, but I wanted to clarify that. I think it's really important, and it's going to be important, very, very important element of this group's work over the next several years. Thank you.
Commissioner Haroon?
Yeah, I think my concern is that it was, I guess there's the city policy, and then there's staff policy within each department that really guides decisions and funding. And I mean, I was bothered by it, that's why I still remember it from several years ago. And when I look at just the absolute value of these quality parks that they provide to families, especially low-income families, and I just have real personal experience with that, being a little kid, and I just wanted to make sure that that was being addressed, and that we were not making decisions in our parks plan based on an overall thing, and there's kids that can't get to a quality park. So that's kind of my, so I want to bring that to the forefront, because I want to make sure that we're not choosing to invest in the wealthy neighborhoods and not in the poor neighborhoods because of some broader policy fear of displacement. The other thing is kind of along, I guess, the lines of equity. Like, I love the themed park areas. I love the themed the concepts. My kids absolutely love them. I didn't know, like, when we got into like cultural and native stuff, if when we're looking at, and again, I guess this is my trying to understand of where we're coming from an equity lens, is if we would take a park and maybe make a Native American themed park where it was like educational and cultural, are those kinds of and I'm not saying to do that, but are those the kinds of things that we're looking at sometimes when we talk about those issues, or is it a little more broad, I guess?
Monica, I'd like to take a shot at that. Appreciate the question, Commissioner Haroon. Using Nikkei Park as an example, we really discovered the Japanese truck farming history as we started to do a scan of the area. We never began thinking, what cultural group should we name the park after? That was never even the start, that was never part of the concept. We just found the opportunity, and it really resonated. So we have named a park after the Japanese immigrants that were an important part of the farming activities in Clark County in the early part of the 20th century. But we're continuing to refine that park naming process and really explore what naming means and how we can better acknowledge history and issues and opportunities for cultural awareness in our parks. But we don't have a roadmap. We're really at a very early stage of kind of figuring out how to best do that. So that's kind of a long way of saying it. We don't really know the answer, but there certainly isn't a playbook or an agenda there. I think those things work best for the community when they're really organic, and there truly is a tie-in, and that there's community involvement in the process. So certainly I would say we're really aware that art and cultural resources in our parks where people go a lot is the cool thing, and we want to do more of that, and we want to figure out how best to do that in a way that enhances the park and really enhances the awareness within our whole community. And I hope that's responsive. I'm happy to follow up if I can help at all.
No, I think it's just kind of right along the lines from, what I was reading, and a great presentation or a great, document you guys have put together. But I was really trying to think of how do we honor our people groups that have been here and create educational and fun, and but yeah, so that does answer my question. I think my final question is on we'd mentioned like safe and walkable. I didn't know if there's is there a overall safety plan or safe design standards that are guiding some of the stuff? I think of well, the kids that call the firefighter park Marshall, where it's a very if you're a parent, it's a very non-contained park because there's no fencing around it. I didn't know if we're looking at kind of safety through environmental design, like when we look at crime prevention through environmental design. Just from a parent standpoint, I look at that park specifically because A, there was a recent kidnapping attempt, and B, it's like if you're a parent there, it takes two parents to watch one kid. In that, just because of how the design of the play structure is, and the kids are everywhere. So I don't know if there was any guiding principles that we're incorporating in our designs there.
I would say that, again, I'm not the designer of the parks, but I know that in conversations with our landscape architects, sight lines are always an important piece. Fencing, we've always defined the property ownership with a fence, and we fence the frontage if it's a safety concern. I know that we frequently try to place the play structures for different age groups in proximity to each other for that very reason, as well as for, not just the play structures, but like the basketball area or something where a parent could see all of them. So it is again, it gets more difficult when you get to community parks that are much larger. But I know that the department engages with maintenance, and they engage with other departments in review of our designs to make sure that they meet those needs.
Great work. Thank you, guys.
And thank you all for the great questions.
So, Julie, no one has signed up from the public?
That's correct.
Okay, so the public testimony is closed. If there are no further questions of staff, we can begin our deliberation and move toward a motion.
Chair, I'm willing to make a motion if there's no discussion.
Commissioner Shower, you move to do what?
I would move to forward a recommendation to the City Council for adoption of the Vancouver Parks and Recreation Cultural Services Comprehensive Plan by reference in Appendix E, the Vancouver Comprehensive Plan.
Good. Is there a second to that motion?
Commissioner Schulte, and I'll second the motion.
So it has been moved by Commissioner Shower and seconded by Commissioner Schulte to forward to City Council a recommendation for adoption of the proposed 2022-2031 Park Plan by reference in Appendix E of the Vancouver Comprehensive Plan. Please call the roll, Julie.
Commissioner Shower.
Approve.
Commissioner Bloffice.
Yes.
Commissioner Atkins.
Approved.
Commissioner Haroon.
Approved.
Commissioner Schulte.
Approved.
Vice Chair Pyle.
Approve.
And Chair Liddell.
Approved. The motion is passed. Thank you to Parks and Recreation Dave Perlick and Monica Tuberville. Also thanks to the Parks and Recreation Advisory Council. I know they put a lot of work into this. And I especially appreciate the comments you made with the extra effort on outreach so that we be sure and include a cross section when we're asking the public what they think. I think this plan really reflects the importance our community places on parks. So thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Any comments, Rebecca, before we adjourn?
No, our next meeting is December 14th. We look forward to seeing everyone then.
Thank you, everybody. We are adjourned.
Good night.